the sign-in sheets on the back table. Thank you for coming. And I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out tonight. And we're here to hear from everybody on their ideas on the downtown Riverfront master plan. That's a part. It'll be part of part of our plan of conservation and development, but specifically, the town was awarded a grant, and Dan hired FHI Studios, these folks, and they're going to be helping us with the plan. I'd like to start out with introductions. I'm Tom Bransfield, currently the chairman of the Brownfield Area Steering Committee. I was going to ask the committee to introduce themselves. Sure. And Jay Azakeenan is out of town, so he can't join us tonight. With that, I was going to turn it over to Dan, talk a little bit about the grant and the whole concept before we get.
Hi, so I'm Dan Beret. I'm the town planner here in town, if you guys don't know. Just to talk a little bit about how this process began. So the town has been working for a long time and getting grants to clean up 248, 222, and 230 Brownstone, and really try to make those old petroleum facilities into something new. So part of this effort was to understand what people in town think. But basically this grant from the state, the Brownfield Area Revitalization Grant, was actually pitched to us by another planning firm. And First Selectman Curley at the time said, you know, we can do this ourselves. So him, myself, and our planning consultant, John Guskowski, along working with UConn and their TAB program for some information, put together an application, and we were successful for this grant. And so we hired FHI Studios with RKG doing the economics and Ty and Bond doing the environmental work. And we worked with Ty and Bond on the site, so it made a lot of sense moving forward. But yeah, we got $200,000 from the state, $20,000 match that the First Selectman and the board were graciously enough to give to us, so we could leverage that money to do something better. And we're really happy with our consultants right now. They've been producing some really interesting information. We had a little preview of their presentation. I think you guys are really going to like it. It has some good insights. And then certainly we're here to get information and feedback from you guys as to what you guys want to see with town. So without any further ado, I would turn it over to Adam. He's a project manager.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to run through a quick presentation that is going to kind of give you an overview of the project. And then Eric and Nick are going to walk through a little bit of some of the details that we understand about the project. I'm just going to say one more time, there's seats up front. We don't bite. I promise you, if you have a problem seeing the slides, there is going to be some information on there that hopefully you can see. But if not, we will be posting this online so you can talk about it a little bit later. So why don't we get started with the slides? Great. So I'm going to start with just a quick team overview. Keep going. When I pause, you can advance the slides. All right. So this is our team. I'm Adam Tex. I'm the project manager. In the back is Raul. He's leading all the community engagement. So he's the one who helped get you all here and set up all of this great activities that we're going to be doing. I'm also going to be joined by Joe McDonald, who's a landscape architect at FHI Studio. It's all good. There we go. Here you can see here Eric is with RKG, and Nick's here, an environmental specialist with Ty and Bond, very familiar with the site. Go to next slide. So project overview. Let's start with the study area. Yeah, go ahead. You can see the maps that are on the table. Our study area really focuses on the area in and around the adventure park, right? The old quarry. So it's really the downtown Main Street. And then The Riverfront Park is included in this because we understand that it's a real asset. I want to be clear about this. We're not suggesting that the Riverfront Park is going to get redeveloped in any way. It's part of the study area so that we can include it in our analysis. But we're really going to be focusing on sort of 4 key sites along the riverfront. Those are the vacant industrial parcels that are there, as well as that one active former tar refining site that's there. We've also been asked to look at the vacant gas station that's right next to the ale or pub house. I just ate there. Thank you. Great burger. Oh my God, like really great food there. I was really surprised. But one of the best I've had in a while. So we're going to be looking at that site. So we're also looking at there's a town-owned property off of Airline Road or Airline Avenue where there's talk about including a boat launch down there, and so that's been included in our study area. So next slide. Quick thing to understand is that 3 of those properties, the contiguous ones, that's 222 Brownstone Ave, 230 and 248 Brownstone Ave, are actually owned by the town of Portland. Some of them are used sort of intermittently during the year to support the adventure park. 150 Brownstone Avenue is not town owned, that's in private ownership, as is 198 Main Street, which is the former gas station. So the process that we're going to go through is a sort of 3-phase process. The first phase is a conditions assessment, and that's a little bit of what we're going to be presenting to you today. So looking at the site, the environment, the market conditions, and sort of the mobility conditions. And that's going to be giving us a really good foundation to understand like the potential for these sites. If we go to the next one. Then we're going to be engaging all of you in a design process. The idea being is that we're going to be creating visions for the future of these sites, what they could become, how they could support both activity on the sites, but also larger township goals. In the end, what we're going to be doing is coming up with a plan that looks at development concepts for those sites. We're going to do a connectivity plan that basically looks at like mobility. So pedestrian access, drivers, buses, transit, bicycle, all the ways that you would maybe get to those sites and around town. And then also looking at a strategic implementation plan. Like, okay, you have an idea, but how do you go forward with all of this? And one thing to just understand is that although I've sort of talked about this in a very linear way, we understand that the design process and the sort of existing conditions process reinforce themselves. So we may be doing some more analysis as we go forward, as we learn more about the sites, think about what these sites might be. We might need to dig in a little bit more on that. So I want to talk a little bit about these development concepts. So the idea is that these are vision plans. I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, but the town, right, although they own these sites, is most likely not going to be the ones who is actually going to build something on these sites. Instead, the idea here is to sort of understand what should these sites be and how could they redevelop in a way that supports your all's vision for your downtown and the riverfront. That'll include like design recommendations. We'll put in some recommendations about zoning, which is sort of the rules that regulate development. But the way I want you all to think about it is a lot of what we're trying to get out of this is your must-haves. So these are things that have to happen on those sites. The great to haves. So those are the things that you'd like to see happen on these sites, but they're not necessarily deal breakers. And then the final one is shouldn't haves. These are the deal breakers. These are the things we don't want to see happen on these sites. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about why we're thinking about it in that way. So if we go to the next one. So the connectivity plan is going to look at like the future pedestrian and bicycle and sort of vehicular network, right? How should people move around this study area? How should people access the site? And so that's both like people moving within the study area, but also people who maybe are coming to the adventure park or coming to get a good burger, or passing through the site and maybe are just there to, move along Main Street, but you want them to move in a way that makes sense and supports your vision for the area. We'll also be talking about like safety, right? Which I know is a big thing on Main Street, aesthetics, and sort of the overall function of the mobility network. And then again, the funding strategy. So we'll be looking at sort of short, medium, and long-term strategies and thinking about how all of this is going to kind of materialize, which is really important, right? We don't want to spend our whole time coming up with a plan without thinking about how you're actually going to make that plan happen. So one thing that I want to talk a little bit about and just give a quick overview. How many people here have heard of something called like a public-private partnership or a P3? Yeah, some familiarity. That's great. All right. So this is one of the key ways that sites like these sites actually move forward, especially when there is like government ownership over the land, which you have for 3 of these sites. And in a public-private partnership, there's sort of both parties, the public side and the private side, have roles and responsibilities that lead to successful project outcomes. So I'm just going to kind of walk through what those are. So on the public role to start with, and we can go to the next one. The idea is the public role, because you have these assets, you are defining the vision and the goals, right? You are out there sort of saying, this is what we want it to become. You frequently will issue something like a request for proposals, okay? And what that means is that you go out there and you say, hey, we have these properties, we own these properties, we would like them to become this vision, this thing that we are. You, private side, come in here and give us a proposal for how you're going to go about achieving that, right? What is it that you can bring to the table to make that happen? Oh, you got ahead of me just a second, but that's all right. I did pause, so not his fault. So the other thing that the public does is typically provides some sort of incentive for the private side to come in. In this case, it's the land ownership, right? That's the skin in the game, as they say, for the public side. But it can also be things like tax breaks. It can also be things like regulatory relief. It can sort of be things like moving projects along faster so that there's less cost for the private side. There's a lot of ways for the public to incentivize or encourage the kinds of things that they want beyond just saying these are the things that we want. And if you think about this, there's a lot of reasons why that might be attractive, right, for investment. And then frequently it sets performance requirements and monitors delivery, basically saying like, this is how we measure success, right? Did you do what you do? And then measuring whether or not that is actually delivered. And the bottom line sort of idea with all of this is that the public role is to protect the public interests, which we're going to be defining through this process. The private role is really very different on this, right? So the private role here is actually develop and design the site, right? So the private developer will come in and they will be investing their money, and they've got a very strong understanding of what they need for their sites. Maybe it's, the parking configuration, maybe it's the configuration of the buildings, how, if it's a, restaurant, what type of restaurant it might be, how big that restaurant needs to be. It sort of helps to establish the physical manifestation of that vision and goals. Frequently, it either buys or leases the land from the public entity. It invests private resources, right? So they're putting in private dollars into this. It manages the construction. The private role sort of delivers all of the services. So frequently when we think about this, the private side is the one who's actually owning and operating the thing that is being built. That's not always true, but that's most frequently the case. And then they typically generate, hopefully, profits for their investors. That's sort of their bottom line interest. And the reason why that this works very well is frequently because the public sky has some sort of asset or has some sort of like thing to offer, right? The public side is or the private side, excuse me, is incentivized to do that thing. And ultimately, how all of this gets sorted out is through a contractual relationship between the two entities. So I know that's a lot to digest, and we can get some questions there going forward, but it's a really important to understand what we're doing. So when I talked about the must-haves, should-haves, and shouldn't-haves, a lot of what we're talking about is defining that vision and goal, right? So that you are establishing the framework under which private investment comes in, and you are establishing the way of monitoring or deciding whether or not that private investment is achieving your goals or not. All right. So I know that's very technical. I know I'm not the most engaging speaker all the time. It's not true. I'm really good. But we'll go on, and I'm going to hand it over to Nick to talk a little bit about the environmental investigation and remediation of the site, so we get a little bit better understanding about what's going on those sites. Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. So thanks again for the Nick Renata. I'm a licensed environmental professional with Ty and Bond. I have my colleague Christy Gagnon with me tonight, who's been involved with work we've done on these properties. And as both Adam and Dan had alluded to, Ty and Bond's been working with the town for, I'd say, the better half of a decade now on the investigation and cleanup, particularly of 222, 230, and 248 Brownstone Avenue. There are some other properties here we'll talk about. You can just flip. So I won't rediscuss all these. We talked about the target properties, but as Adam had said, 222, 230, 248, 150, they're all along the riverfront. We have the old gas station on Main Street. These are all former commercial and industrialized sites. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague to talk a little bit about the history and some of the work that's been done on these properties.
Thanks, Nick. Can everyone hear me okay? I talk quiet. Good in the back? Okay. So I'll let you know next slide. So no surprise, this go for it. So historically, this operated as the Brownstone Quarry, and historical operations largely tie into anything environmental that we need to do today. So for about 60 years, in particular, the 222, 230, 248 were involved. It was part of the stone cuttings yard. And then after that period, for the most part, the facilities were involved with either asphalt or tar production. 230 was used for bulk petroleum storage at the time. And the properties are currently vacant. They're used as overflow parking right now for the Brownstone to support when that is busy. As we mentioned, they're town owned. This is the adjacent 150 Brownstone, again, similar with asphalt and tar production. It is privately owned. And then the Main Street property was a former gas station that was there for about 60 years. So again, some similarities, privately owned, currently vacant, but what's common among all the properties is that they have a mechanism for environmental cleanup that was a result of these historical operations. So there's been a series of investigations on all of the target properties, and the outcome essentially is there were impacts to both soil and groundwater. So primarily we found petroleum substances and then impacts identified from the fill that had been placed there along the Connecticut River. So based on the investigations, we identified concentrations of these contaminants, and they were above state cleanup criteria, and so that is where we've been heavily involved. So essentially, we've kind of stated a lot of this has been made possible through a series of grants that was awarded to the town of Portland. And we've been investigating for, I believe, since 2013, we've had involvement, but we did start remediation in 2022. So just to give you a recap of some of the progress that we've been able to do for these sites. So a lot of this had to deal particularly with the 248 Brownstone property, but we were able to facilitate 6 of the former bulk storage tanks were demolished and taken off site. 3 underground storage tanks were discovered and also taken off site. Oh, back one. And so a lot of the investigation led to some targeted excavation and remediation through offsite disposal. And again, a lot of the historical impacts, petroleum related, about 5,000 tons of soil ended up needing to be removed from the 248 brownstone in particular. And this is just to kind of show, again, a good aerial of progress. So this is from 2020 to 2024. So we've also, along with all the excavation and tank removals, we've been able to facilitate the demolition and abatement of the scale house. There was a former block shed, the canopies for dispensing. We've also completed some quarterly groundwater monitoring, which would be a requirement for the sites to support remediation. And I will give it back to Nick for where we're at now.
And I'll just stress that there's a very high level overview of the work that's been done over the years. There's been lots of hours and time put into it, a very significant effort in terms of site investigation and remediation on all of these properties, to date. So just to kind of put everything into perspective, where are we today? See, these are some of the key takeaways. So the site investigations are complete. And the environmental conditions are well understood. So that is more than half the battle when you're dealing with brownfields properties and uncertainty with respect to environmental contamination and how does that impact, redevelopment. So this is the good news. We know quite a bit about these properties from an environmental perspective. As Christy had shown, there's been significant remedial progress made on all of these properties. So they're essentially been cleaned up in a significant manner, as of today. All these sites in one way or another are enrolled into formal DEEP programs that allow someone like myself as an LEP to verify that the site has been cleaned up in accordance with state standards. The most important part of that is at the end of the day, you will have a sanctioned cleanup that will essentially meet state standards and be protective of human health and the environment. So moving forward, the remediation will ultimately depend on development. And this is a very common approach that's used for properties like this, brownfields redevelopment. We use strategies like capping and land use restrictions. Capping essentially takes things like parking lots and buildings and encapsulates polluted soil that may remain on the properties. Like I said, it's a very common approach. But most of the work requiring removal of materials from the site has been completed to date. So that would be the path forward. As part of this entire process, we will evaluate various scenarios and how we integrate the two together. But lastly, current cleanup with future development can leverage additional funding. So through this process, basically what we're saying is, keep going. There's a lot of momentum, a lot of work has been done. Through this entire process, it'll be the ability to leverage more funding to support the type of cleanup that's needed to realize vision and the redevelopment of these sites. It's a big picture.
Yeah, so Nick, would it be fair to say that as things sit right now, the sort of contamination of the soil doesn't create a significant barrier to development?
That's correct.
Of what would be development?
That's correct. Yes, that's correct. Yes, absolutely. And that's a good point, Adam. Yeah, so things like residential development, that is possible, right? With a proper land use restriction. And again, as I said before, these are all very, very common approaches that are used on sites like this. Every town, every city, many programs with many sites. So absolutely. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Okay. And I'm taller. I'm Eric Halverson. I'm a principal with RKG Associates, and our firm on this project and on many projects, we sort of live in what Adam was describing. We live in the middle of what Adam was describing before between the public and private partnerships. So what we find a lot of times is the public's developing a vision like we're going to work on tonight, and then the private sector wants to do something after the vision's created. Sometimes those two things are in conflict. So our role is to sort of define the market, working for the public sector in this case, and trying to figure out, well, what would the market actually support here? What are market supportable uses for these different sites? And then blending that with the vision, with all the environmental information, the transportation information, the zoning, all the good stuff that we need for implementation. So we have done a ton of market research and work that we've presented to the committee, but I only have like 4 minutes to share with you the key findings tonight, but I hope it'll help set the stage for our conversations together. So I just want to sort of highlight a couple of market segments where I think there might be some opportunities here. So the first is just around residential. Portland's population has been largely flat for the last 20 to 25 years or so, but there has been some new residential interest and construction happening in the town, particularly with the addition of what's going on at Brainerd Place. When we looked at Connecticut's, the state does projections for each municipality across the whole state going out to the year 2040. And when we look at the projections for Portland, we can see the population in 2023, almost 9,500. But by 2040, the projections show that growing, by about 700 or so new residents. If we were to take a typical household size in the town of Portland, which is about 2.4 persons per household, and just divide that by the population change, you would get the potential new number of housing units that you would need to support that population change, which is roughly 302 additional units by the year 2040. So not a lot of growth. Again, Portland's been a relatively stable town from a residential and housing perspective, but there is demand based on future population projection. And from what we understand from talking to some developers in the area, there's certainly demand for housing. That demand doesn't necessarily have to come from just within Portland. It can come from the surrounding region, from surrounding communities. The housing market is sort of fluid. It doesn't necessarily recognize municipal boundaries a lot of times. So I do think as we're thinking about what could be done here, it might be worth considering housing on one or more sites. Next slide, please. We also took a look at commercial development, industrial, retail, and also hotel and hospitality as part of our market study. As we look at things like office, we often look at market demand drivers. So how is vacancy in the current office market? Are rents increasing or decreasing? In this case, we also look at employment changes. So we look at how office using industry sectors and employment might be changing within Portland, but also within the larger region. For that, we considered all of the communities that are adjacent to Portland, almost as far north as Hartford. And we looked at how employment change over the next 10 years is projected across different office using industries. And the interesting thing is for Portland, there's some change primarily focused in healthcare. So it could be medical offices of different types, and also what we call professional technical services sector. That would be like on the smaller scale, that would be something like an attorney or a planning office or an architect, something that needs smaller office space. And those are also changing broadly in the larger region, but they're not changing quite enough where you'd land a big office headquarters per se. There's not a whole lot of that going on in today's market anyway. But I think if you had some strategic locations to encourage smaller scale office, that might be a great complementary use in specific places. Maybe that's more appropriate along Main Street versus along the riverfront. Given that there is some industrial development and these are former industrial sites, we did want to take a look at the industrial market. So I think similar story here in Portland, there is some industrial demand, largely concentrated in the construction industry, as well as in wholesale trade. So demand over the next 10 years of about 22,000 square feet. But you can see when we zoom out to the region, just given the communities that are surrounding Portland, the amount of land that they have in their location, there's a lot more demand there for that. If you wanted to consider industrial for these sites as part of our discussions, it could make sense again at the smaller scale. The parcels are of a smaller size, so you're not going to get a 1 million square foot Amazon warehouse in this location. But there could be, some smaller select, industrial or flex users that might want to locate here. On the retail side, on the next slide, thanks. We look at how household spending demand compares to the number of retail businesses that are in a certain trade area. So for this, we used a 3-mile circular radius from Main Street. in Portland, and we took a look at how household spending compares to the amount of sales that these retail businesses have. If we have more household spending than the businesses in that study area are generating, it means people are spending money outside of that 3 mile radius. They have to leave that area to spend their money. If we have more sales than we do household spending, it means people are coming into the market and spending their money. The graph on the right, I apologize, it's a little bit small. But those show different retail and restaurant and food and beverage categories. And the larger that green line, the more potential demand there is for those retail services within the 3 mile radius. So if we're thinking about things that might complement some of the businesses that are along Main Street today, or even some riverfront development, if we had mixed use down there, residential and some commercial and retail, we might want to target things like dining and drinking, specialty and niche retailers, which would be your smaller stores. Apparel and accessories would be things like clothing or jewelry or shoes. General merchandise is the really, really long green bar, but that is only big because there's not a lot of, those are typically like big box stores. Again, probably not appropriate for this study area, but there's not a whole lot of them in the 3 mile, which is why you see the spending so high. So the good news is there's definitely demand for some additional retail. I would just recommend that, the town be very strategic about where that is so that we don't build vacant commercial space over time. So just being really smart and strategic about where that is. And just the last slide, this is just a summary of what I talked about. When this gets posted, you'll be able to take a look at it. One thing I didn't spend a lot of time on is the hotel and accommodations. There is demand in the market, I think, for a smaller scale hotel, maybe 100 to 125 rooms. The reason being, vacancy is at a point in the market where I think it could tip to have some additional hotel demand. There are also a lot of potential room night drivers in Portland and in the surrounding community, particularly as you cross the river into Middletown. You'll have the spa at some point. You have the adventure park. There's a bunch of golf courses here. You have the wedding venue on the river. You also have the university across the river. So there's a lot of potential drivers that could capture some of that hotel demand in the future. So I think that might be something worth considering.
So some food for thought, no? Hopefully that was informative for everybody. We're gonna go into some breakout discussion groups. We've got facilitators here. We're gonna be sitting around with you. We've got the maps on the table. Before we do that though, I'm just curious if anybody has any like clarifying questions here. If you have, and I want to be really clarifying questions, not like I have an idea and I'm going to disguise it as a question, but like because we're going to have plenty of time to talk about ideas. But, we just presented a lot of information here and I'm just curious if anybody had any, questions.
I don't think it did when the state did that, but that's a great point. Some of that will be taken up by the development that's happening there.
Yeah, and I will just say sort of anecdotally right now, housing is in very sort of high demand and it's one of the sort of things that's getting built a lot. And so I think there's certainly likely interest around some of that. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, we're gonna have plenty of time to talk about sort of the different options and questions and concerns. Any other clarifying questions or? Yeah.
Got a question. Know that the land has been reclaimed to a certain level.
Yeah.
That can be used for a certain purpose.
Yeah.
Like the building housing, building for factory offices. Additional remediation would need to be done.
So I want to put a kind of underline and score, and Nick, you can kind of talk to this a little bit. So I think the way to think about it is all of the really heavy, nasty stuff has been taken, and that's an LSRP term, right? Nasty stuff, right? That's a really like all the has been, yeah, exactly, has been taken out. And what that basically leaves you with is what's sort of just generically called contaminated soil, contaminated fill. Okay. And what that means is what you need to do is basically create some sort of barrier between it and things that are happening on top of it, which is what Nick called the cap. Okay. And that cap can take essentially, and Nick, you can clarify if I'm getting this wrong. Yeah, two forms. One is something hard that you can't like get down to the soil to touch. So pavement for the most part, right? Parking lots, buildings, things like that. So if you think about it, literally you can't just go out into a parking lot and get to the soil underneath you. That protects you from sort of touching that contaminated soil. The other option is to take sort of clean soil and put it on top of that. But then you've got to put, what is it, 4 feet? 4 feet of clean fill on top of that. So that's about that much. And think about that spread over a large site. It's an incredible amount of earth that you have to put on it. One thing that we haven't talked about and we'll talk about going forward is these areas are all in the floodplains, right? That's kind of why the quarry is in the condition that it is right now. So if you started talking about putting clean fill on top of it, you'd have to start thinking about what impact that would have on the flooding and all of that, but we'll kind of get there. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Could there be more remediation so that there is a clean, that the soil is clean? Or is there so much?
Yeah, it's so like mixed in. It's basically you got to put something on top of it to prevent you. Is that right? I mean, is that fair? Yeah, so think about it a lot like if there's a soil there, right? You just need to put something on top that prevents you from touching that soil. And so pavement would be one of those, or buildings would be one of those things. Right. Because we're recording.
So the entire Connecticut River, both on Portland side and even on Middletown, if you look at published geologic mapping or soils maps, right, was artificially filled. So it contains things from the quarry, like brownstone tailings. And this filling occurred, 100 years ago, right? Over time and different types of fills. So it can really contain all sorts of different things, asphalt and concrete and brick, demolition debris. It can contain things like these sites were used for tar and asphalt manufacturing. So we see tar in the ground. These things all contain what we call polluting substances. So largely there is a significant quantity of fill, along the river, that contains these types of polluting substances. When we have a release, something that occurs into that, we've remediated those things. Like let's say a tank released fuel oil and it's spilled into the ground. So we've gone after those things. Those are the bad things, right? And we've remediated those, removed them. What we're left with is mainly polluted fill, which can be capped. There's lots of different ways you can do it. Adam explained some of those ways. And with the right capping and right use restrictions, it doesn't limit your ability to do like residential. There's lots of different options that you can.
So yeah, so I think we need to talk a little, we'll talk a little bit about that. It is not a great place to say like, hey, we want to put a park down there, right? Because there are ways of doing that, but then 4 feet of clean fill on top of it, right? To do that. And so, yes, you want to generally discourage people getting in and touching soil. Yeah. So that's a great, so I really want to be really, so I want to be really clear about that. And I really want to underscore. So the town has done an incredible amount of work to get to the sites where they're at. And the, like all of the state standards, all of these kind of things that are meant to out there to protect you so that you don't get sick. The simple, great solution that you're at right now is to cap it, and that the which is really important for all of this is that is part of the natural development process that somebody would do to build a coffee shop or homes or to do. So the town has done so much work to this point that from a developer's perspective, it is not like they are coming in and they've got to pull out all these tanks and do all of this remediation work. It's actually in a really good position for investment. And I think that's really critical here. So yes, you may not get like flower beds and beautiful landscaped, sort of spaces, but you could actually get, real, something that is economically active there. So I want to go here and then we'll go over here. Yeah. Yeah.
Around so that the park.
So
Not the.
I would think, I want you to think about it this way, and I'll let you hop in here right now, is that like the parking lot as it sits, how you guys have been down there, it's like basically all covered in asphalt. For the most part, you need something like that covering every bit over it. And if you don't do that, the only other option is to put 4 feet of clean fill on top. And the one thing that I will just give you, the background on, it's in a flood area. And so if you put 4 feet of fill in a flood area, what's going to happen to the water? Yeah, it's going to go somewhere else. So then you start getting compounding issues. We can look at that. We can talk about that. But it's something that we really need to be paying attention to here. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, Ty and Bond as a whole, I mean, we work on many, many brownfield sites throughout the entire state of Connecticut, various towns, small towns, big cities. And as I said before, Adam described capping when you have polluted fill that's there is probably the most common approach. If you had to think about it, Adam described the example of 4 feet of cover, right? That's a requirement in the regulations. You couldn't do it because you're in a floodplain, because that would create, someone mentioned compensatory storage, that'd be an issue. If you wanted to do that, you'd have to cut 4 feet and replace it with 4 feet, which would be a astronomical cost to dispose and displace of all that material. And actually, and sometimes is viewed as creating more contamination when you're handling it more and so on and so forth, because a lot of measures need to be taken while you're handling polluted material. So, but yes, this is, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of properties that have been remediated this way. DEP and DECD maintains a list of brownfields, an inventory, so to say, and there's many, 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 many that take a very similar approach.
Yeah. And just to underscore this, there are really serious regulations that any investor in this property would have to follow to protect public health and safety. So that's key. Any other questions? This is really important here because I want to make sure we're all on the same page before we get into the. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yep.
Talking about these different types.
Yep. 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 Great. Yep. Great. Great. Yep. 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 Yes. Does that answer your question? No, no. Yeah. So the idea here is, right, we have these focus areas, right? These properties that are probably the most pressing sort of thing that need to get a vision and a thing. We are also looking at the greater downtown area. So if you have thoughts about how Main Street could be improved, if you have thoughts about what might attract a different type of business or that might be located in that study area, if there are other locations here that you say, hey, it would be great if, please share those thoughts and ideas. We're really at the beginning phases of all of this, so we want to kind of get all the ideas out on the table. All right. So why don't we do that? Why don't we start by breaking into groups? We've got 2, 6, 8, 25. You had 5, Raul? 5. Okay. So we've got 5 tables. Maybe we can spread them out a little bit so we're not talking all over. So yeah, why don't we take one back there and we'll move this one up. If the Brownfields committee people can sort of break up into separate tables, and then we'll each take a table. All right. Great. Thank you all.